All right, before you start writing your humanities paper, we wanted to review CECA, which you learned last year, and the process of embedding quotes, which we've covered in this unit. So let's look at what happens once you find a piece of evidence. So say I want to prove the control tactic of censorship. I might choose this quote from 1984. The most deadly danger was talking in your sleep. So now I've got evidence. What do I do with it? Well, you should remember this process of CECA, which we went over last year when we wrote other humanities analytic papers. Let's review what each of those steps stands for. C stands for context, and context means any background information that your reader needs to know or remember to understand your evidence. The context for a quote also includes a quote lead-in or tag. Remember that the sentence with the quote in it must start with your words and then flow into the quote itself. It shouldn't end with a period and then dump the quote in. And that both of those go into the context. The E stands for evidence, and evidence is a carefully chosen quotation or fact that demonstrates your control tactic in a way that supports your thesis. The second C stands for citation, and the citation shows where you got your evidence. It always comes in parentheses after your evidence, and for English, it will include the author's name. If you've got two books by an author, like 1984 and Animal Farm, you've got to include the book title as well and the page number. For Atwood, we only have one book by Atwood. And for history, you can say the history packet, comma, and then the title of the packet and the page of the packet where you found the information. The last A stands for analysis, and analysis explains both why the quote is important, that's the interpretation part, and how the quote supports your argument, that's the commentary part. So remember that analysis is made up of those two parts together that work together to explain your quote and connect it back to your thesis. So let's look at what the steps of CECA look like in this control tactics paper. What's in gray here is the topic sentence of my paragraph, which gives the claim that I'm proving. So in this paragraph, I'm going to prove one of the control tactics. It says, totalitarian governments limit expression and access to information through censorship. When people are censored, they cannot explore new ideas and have fewer opportunities to grow intellectually. This makes their thinking easier to control because they're exposed to less diversity of thought. So both of my examples in this paragraph are going to relate to this idea of censorship and making people easier to control through less exposure to other ideas. Let's move into the first C now. So remember that the first C stands for context. There's actually two kinds of context you're going to want to include in your paragraphs. The first time you talk about a book or a dictator, you might have to give some general context about what that dictator, when that dictator lived, where that dictator was, what the book was about. So for me, I need some general context about 1984. So I wrote, the novel 1984 by George Orwell describes a dystopian society called Oceania, run by a central party and a figurehead called Big Brother. In addition to that general context, I also need to give specific context that situates my quote where it shows up in the book and explains what situation my quote relates to. So then I wrote specific context. It looks like this. The citizens of Oceania are constantly monitored to make sure that their words always show their loyalty to the party. And then remember that the last part of the context I need is the actual quote lead-in that will flow into the quote. You have to work with the context and your quote to make those two things match up. Here's how I wrote mine. For this reason, and now I'm ready to move into the evidence. So here's the evidence portion. For this reason, the most deadly danger was talking in your sleep. And that's the evidence portion of my argument. Now I'm moving into the second C, which is citation. And it looks like this. Orwell, 1984, page 64, period. So now I'm moving into the A, and that's the analysis portion. Remember that analysis starts with interpretation. And interpretation is kind of like the say and the mean parts of your say, mean, matter practice. It both explains the quote in a simple way and also explains what is important or significant about the quote. So the first part of my analysis, my interpretation, looks like this. This quote shows that Oceanians are forced to censor anti-party ideas even when they are asleep and can never truly say what is on their minds. So in my interpretation, I'm explaining what is important about talking in your sleep being dangerous. I'm going back to the quote, and that's the interpretation. The second part of my analysis is the commentary part, and that looks like this. In order to remain safe from harm, Oceanians restrict their own freedom of thought. They train themselves to be loyal to the party over and above any external government controls. And that is connecting back to the claim that I've set up at the beginning of my paragraph that says that censorship should make people easier to control. So here I'm explaining that they're easier to control because they restrict their own freedom of thought and censor ideas from their own brains. I'm connecting back to that claim. So the commentary connects back. This year, as we work with CECA, you're going to continue to follow the same general structure, but you can get a little bit more flexible with it. So you'll notice here, I have my claim, I have my context, my evidence, my citation, and then when you look at the bolded part of the analysis, the interpretation part, you'll notice I've crossed out "this quote shows that." One thing you might want to experiment this year is taking away those sentence starters that we drilled you on last year, because you can sometimes just take them out and start the sentence without them, and it cleans up your writing and makes it a little less wordy. Let's listen to what that sounds like if we read from the beginning of the orange. The novel 1984 by George Orwell describes a dystopian society called Oceania, run by a central party and a figurehead called Big Brother. The citizens of Oceania are constantly monitored to make sure that their words always show their loyalty to the party. For this reason, the most deadly danger was talking in your sleep. Orwell, 1984, page 64. Oceanians are forced to self-censor anti-party ideas even when they are asleep, and can never truly say what is on their minds. So you'll hear it flows through just fine. Some people might like it better because there's fewer words that you don't really need. Other people might like the flow of "this quote shows that," and that's okay too. But it's something to experiment this year as you start to make CECA your own, about which opening phrases you can drop to make your writing less wordy. Another thing to experiment with in CECA is moving your interpretation around. So interpretation always has to show up. You have to set up what is important to notice about your quote. And we taught you that you should always do it right after the quote. But you can also work that into your context to set the context up that in a way that kind of precedes the interpretation and sets up what we should be noticing about the quote before you even see it. So that looks like this. You'll notice that here, the underlined parts, Oceanians can never truly say what is on their minds, has now moved to before the quote. So the interpretation is moving before I give the quote, and this is what it sounds like. The citizens of Oceania are constantly monitored to make sure that their words always show their loyalty to the party. To avoid vaporization, Oceanians learn not to say what is truly on their minds. For this reason, the most deadly danger was talking in your sleep. Orwell, 1984, page 64. And then I've added more analysis because I've already done the interpretation. Even though dreams are supposed to be the place where we are freest to explore our own ideas, Oceanians are forced to self-censor anti-party ideas from their speech even while sleeping. As Oceanians restrict their own freedom of thought, they train themselves to be loyal to the party over and above any external government controls. So here you'll see I've moved the interpretation before the quote, and then I build up my analysis a little bit after the quote because I've got more space. So again, as you start to make CECA more flexible this year, feel free to get rid of some of those opening phrases and also to move around the interpretation and experiment with blending your interpretation with the context if that works for you. Good luck. I hope your writing goes well.